Everything you live through was once an impulse in your mind. Before a fight begins, a belief organizes the muscles that brace for it. Before a career stalls, a story about your worth arranges the decisions that slow you down. This is the central claim we will hold to from the first sentence. The Hermetic axiom, often paraphrased as within, so without, is not a mystical slogan divorced from experience. It is a practical description of how inner landscapes, the habitual thoughts, images, and orientations of attention inside you, shape the architecture of your outer life. Think of your inner life as a workshop and your outer life as the furniture that comes out of it. If the shelves are crowded with rot and dust, the furniture will carry that smell. If the tools are blunt or misused, the pieces will wobble. If you want a different arrangement of rooms, you must begin by changing what is being worked on the workbench. Your attention, the narratives you tell yourself, the images that recur when your mind is idle. This is Hermetic thinking reframed psychologically, not a promise that thought magically rearranges the world, but a map that explains how thought channels perception, behavior, and habit, and so shapes circumstances. Before we go further, if this way of talking about inner change as something practical and psychological rather than mystical feels useful to you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next parts. In a minute, I'm going to give you a simple exercise you can do right now that makes this mechanism obvious. Before we go deeper, pause for a moment and choose one persistent inner narrative. One sentence that keeps returning in your mind when things go sideways. It might be something simple. I never get ahead. People always let me down. I am not enough. Write that sentence down now and keep it in view for the next part of this talk. Returning to it will let you test the claims we unpack. Watch how that inner line becomes a script you reenact outside. If the Hermetic maxim feels foreign, some historical context will help. For centuries, a group of craftspeople and thinkers who called themselves alchemists described a process they called the magnum opus, or the great work. Their vocabulary is strange to modern ears. They spoke of earth and mercury, blackening and whitening, crucibles and philosophical gold. But beneath the theatrical language, they were doing something recognizably psychological. In workshops and manuscript margins, they recorded a sequence of transformations, a breakdown, a clarification, a dawning of inner light, and finally, a kind of re-embodied wholeness. To them, turning lead into gold was often shorthand. Real transmutation was the reconfiguration of the practitioner's own soul. Two names anchor this tradition in our modern understanding. Hermes Trismegistus, a quasi-mythical figure conflating Greek and Egyptian wisdom, stood as an emblem of the idea that cosmic and human processes mirror each other. Paracelsus, a Renaissance physician and experimentalist, carried forward a practice where the physical, the material, and the spiritual were braided. Their documents and allegories circulated for centuries, sometimes literal, sometimes poetic, always symbolic. In the 20th century, Carl Gustav Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist and thinker, approached the alchemical corpus not as a literal chemical manual, but as a symbolic map of psychological transformation. He found in those images an astonishing parallel to the processes he observed in therapy: a descent into darkness, encounters with repressed parts of the personality, moments of purification, and eventually an emergence into a new orientation of meaning and purpose. Jung did not take the metaphysics of alchemy at face value. He treated the symbols as expressions of archetypal patterns within the psyche. For him, the magnum opus described stages the soul undergoes when it moves from fragmentation toward a more integrated center, a process he called individuation. This pairing of alchemical symbolism and Jungian psychology gives us a scaffold for understanding how internal thought structures are translated into outer life. The alchemical stages, nigredo, blackening, albedo, whitening, citrinitas, yellowing, and rubedo, reddening, correspond to psychological phases. Each stage shapes the way thought operates, and each thought pattern leads to characteristic outcomes in relationships, work, and meaning. We will walk through these stages carefully because they explain more than metaphor. They reveal mechanisms. At the heart of the mechanism is a chain anyone can observe, repeated in countless small experiments. Attention shapes perception, perception frames interpretation, interpretation guides behavior, repeated behavior forms habit, habit creates circumstance. If you pay attention mostly to threat, your perception filters the world through potential danger. You interpret neutral events as hostile, you withdraw or react defensively. Those reactions invite distance or provocation from others. The outer situation hardens into proof of your initial suspicion. What began as a thought has, through a cascade of small choices, hardened into reality. Now, if this chain has clarified something for you so far, leave a like on the video. It's a simple signal that this level of work is worth continuing. Projection is a key motor in this process. Projection is the mechanism by which unintegrated parts of the psyche, traits, fears, desires not owned, are seen as features of the outside world or other people. Imagine a person with a deeply buried fear of being abandoned. When they feel an emotionless glance from a loved one, they might construe it as impending abandonment, escalate with anxious behaviors, and in time drive the other person away. The outside situation appears to confirm the internal narrative, though the causal arrow runs, at least in part, from inside to outside. A short experiment you can try right now, simple and revealing, is this. Recall a recent time when you felt strongly judged, slighted, or blocked. Rewrite the event twice. The first rewrite stays faithful to your immediate interpretation. The other person was wrong, the world was unfair, the outcome proves you were right to distrust. The second rewrite inserts the possibility that some inner script might have guided your perception. What if that person's curt tone triggered an old fear? What choices did you make in response that shaped the outcome? Notice the difference in felt responsibility and in the number of actionable next steps available to you. That difference is exactly the pivot Hermetic thinking points to. Change the inner script, and the future episodes you set in motion change with it. To make this practical rather than speculative, the alchemical map is useful because it gives a staged sequence of what typically happens when someone engages in deep inner work, voluntarily or by necessity, and how each stage corresponds to an external pattern. The first stage is nigredo. Its image is of putrefaction, darkness, the composting of old matter. Psychologically, nigredo is a breakdown of existing meanings. Certainties lose their hold, familiar patterns unravel, repressed material rises and makes the surface turbulent. Inside, nigredo may feel like despair, numbness, confusion, or a collapse of narrative. But as destructive as it feels, nigredo is a crucible where unworked shadows are allowed to surface. Externally, nigredo often shows up as a cascade of apparent losses or disruptions. Relationships that were solid suddenly crack. Work that used to feel meaningful slips away. The structures you once relied upon fail in small or large ways. Importantly, these are not punishments or cosmic retribution. Instead, they are the natural fallout when internal coherence dissolves. Old thoughts that used to provide guidance begin to contradict observable experience, and life, like a faithful mirror, begins to reflect that inner corrosion. To understand nigredo more concretely, imagine two narratives that often sit beneath it. The first is a narrative of worthlessness. If they knew the real me, they would leave. The second is a narrative of control. If I can maintain the right image, I can avoid pain. When those narratives are challenged, perhaps by grief, loss, a workplace change, or an honest confrontation, the defense systems built on them collapse. The mind's attempts to shore up safety may become more frantic. Clinging, accusation, withdrawal. These are the behaviors that cast the outer world into the patterns you now recognize. Friends pulling away, promotions missed, loneliness deepened. If you're recognizing yourself in this stage, write here in the comments, Negredo. But Negredo is not merely a pathology. It can be the beginning of transformation. The alchemists were blunt. Blackness is necessary. In chemical terms, a substance must decay before it can recombine into something new. Psychologically, the surfacing of shadow content, those disowned impulses, shameful memories and unwanted desires must be allowed and seen before integration is possible. This is where disciplined practices and safeguards matter. The descent must be held within a framework that minimizes risk and allows insight to settle rather than to overwhelm. If you are in a space where old meanings are dissolving, here are practical, stage-relevant practices you can adopt. First, containment. Containment is not suppression. It is creating a container for difficult experience so that it does not spill destructively into relationships or work. Containment can be as simple as establishing a clear routine of sleep and meals, assigning specific short times for intense reflection, for example, a 30-minute journaling window in the evening, and setting clear agreements with loved ones about when you might need solitude versus engagement. Containment also means having a safety plan, a trusted friend, a therapist, or a support group you can call if you find yourself acting out of panic or despair. It is practical, preventive, and humble. You are not attempting to be heroic in isolation. Second, focused journaling. Rather than a free stream that can become ruminative, use prompts that aim for clarity. Notice a recurring image or sentence that colonizes your mind. Timestamp when it arrives and what triggered it. Ask what you feel in the body when the thought arises. Ask what action the thought inclines you toward. Write the answers in short, bullet-like sentences. This turns thick feeling into discrete data points you can later examine without being swallowed by them. One useful prompt is, when X happens, I tell myself Y. The next likely action I take is Z. Over days, this pattern will reveal how thought generates behavior and how behavior shapes circumstance. Third, minimal behavioral experiments. A hallmark of Negredo is reactive behavior that amplifies the inner narrative. Design micro-experiments that interrupt those automatic loops. If your pattern is to withdraw when anxious, try a small opposite action for a limited time. Send a brief, honest text to a friend saying you felt anxious and would appreciate a short check-in call. If your pattern is to control through perfectionism, deliberately hand over a small, low-risk task to someone else and note what actually happens. The experiments are not about proving anything definitive. They are about gathering evidence to test whether the inner script maps onto reality as rigidly as you believe. Fourth, dream noting and image work. In Negredo, the unconscious often speaks loudly through images and symbolism. Keep a small notebook by your bed and upon waking, write a line or two about any dream image you recall. Later, map that image onto waking life. Does the dream present a theme of chasing, loss, or being unseen? These images frequently point directly to the shadow material that is informing your daytime narratives. If dreams are intense or frightening to the point of destabilizing, slow the practice and seek a clinician or experienced guide who works with dream material. To make this feel real, let me show you what this looks like in an actual life. And then I'll show you a second angle. Here's one example. Elena led a small non-profit. For years, her identity was wrapped around being the person who never failed, the one who carried everyone's expectations. After a relationship breakup, followed by a significant funding shortfall, Her inner script, "I must keep everything together," cracked. She found herself snapping at colleagues, cancelling meetings and drinking more than usual. Outside, her board lost confidence, donors drifted, and isolation deepened. When she began targeted containment, a weekly supervision call with a mentor, strict sleep hygiene, and a 30-minute nightly journal asking, "What belief was I defending today?" the reactive fury softened. She introduced a micro-experiment, delegating an administrative task to a junior staffer and tracking outcomes. The task was completed well, and the resulting data allowed her to update the inner narrative from "if I let go, everything collapses" to "I can share responsibility and still hold the mission." The outer life did not suddenly fix itself. Funding remained tight for months, but the pattern that had been accelerating collapse had slowed, creating space for deliberate choices that gradually changed circumstance. And here's another example from the clinical side of this work. Early in his career, Jung described patients who underwent what he called a confrontation with the unconscious, a period where dream images and spontaneous fantasies grew intense and demanding. One patient, struggling after the death of a parent, reported a torrent of images, faces dissolving, rooms being sealed. Her habitual response had been to repress and maintain a stoic front, which externally maintained a facade while internal pressure built. Under careful therapeutic containment, the analyst offered a steady frame, limited sessions, and graduated exercises in image exploration. The patient could practice acknowledging the images instead of being crushed by them. Over time, the frantic compulsion that had driven her to overwork and to withdraw from friends diminished. This professional frame prevented overwhelm and allowed the inner contents to become material for reflection rather than engines of self-destruction. Note the common elements. The internal narrative shaped behavior, behavior shaped relationships and career outcomes, and disciplined practices altered the trajectory. None of these examples promises an overnight miracle. Rather, they show a gradual reconfiguration where inner changes prefigure outer ones. There are also important cautions embedded in the story of Negredo. Not every descent into darkness is therapeutic. Sometimes, what appears to be fruitful breakdown is actually a destabilizing spiral that requires clinical attention. If you find yourself having persistent thoughts of harming yourself or others, or experiencing hallucinations or disconnection from shared reality, it is essential to reach out for professional support. A guide, whether a psychotherapist, a spiritual director, or a trusted community member, should be experienced in holding intense psychic material. Safeguards are not signs of weakness. They are the infrastructure that makes deep work sustainable. Another danger in Negredo is the temptation to mistake immersion for progress. Some people confound being in turmoil with being on a sacred path and therefore refuse practical constraints. This romanticization can prolong harm. Negredo requires honest accountability. Is the pain clarifying, or is it needlessly destructive? An honest answer often arrives from external feedback. Friends who say you are more volatile than before, missed work responsibilities, or worsening physical health. These are signals to reinforce containment and to seek integration rather than to wallow in breakdown for its own sake. As Negredo runs its course, and one's inner narratives are exposed, named and observed, the psyche often reaches for a different response, reflection. This movement corresponds to the next alchemical stage, albedo, a word that literally means whitening. Symbolically, albedo connotes purification and the reappearance of clarity. Psychologically, it is when a person begins to step back from automatic identification with troublesome thoughts and can observe them with increasing clarity. The outer life begins to stabilize in small ways. Relationships that had been fraying begin to have new conversations. Decisions are made with slightly more awareness. Choices emerge that align more with values than with reactivity. But this movement is not linear or guaranteed. Many get stuck in an extended trench of analysis after nigredo, an unending looking without integrated action. Analysis for its own sake can become a new form of defensiveness, intellectualizing to avoid feeling, cataloging patterns to avoid changing behavior. The verge between albedo and mere rumination is thin. Recognizing the difference requires both practice and an honest appraisal of outcomes. Does the increased clarity produce different actions? Are your external situations changing in ways that match the inner work? If not, adjust. Introduce experiments, commit to small behaviors that test new assumptions, and seek feedback from people who are invested in your actual change. Before we go further into albedo and beyond, pause again with the sentence you wrote earlier, that persistent inner narrative. Look at it closely now and ask 3 brief questions. Where does this sentence come from in my past? What action does it usually precipitate? And what small evidence would contradict it if true? These questions are the bridge between nigredo and albedo. One points backward to origin, one points forward to behavior, and one invites testable disconfirmation. We can already see the logic of the Hermetic claim. When the inner narrative shifts, attention and perception adjust, which allows different behavior, which in time reshapes circumstance. The alchemical map gives language to each inflection point. Nigredo is the necessary darkening that exposes what has been hidden. Albedo is the clearing mirror that reflects the newly visible material. Citrinitas, the dawning of yellow, will be the stage where meaning and purpose consolidate. Rubedo is the stage where integration expresses itself as sustained, outwardly consistent activity in the world. What follows next, as we begin to enter into the space of albedo and the work that converts reflective insight into experimental action, requires both courage and modesty. Courage to hold what you find when you look, and modesty to accept that insight alone will not substitute for embodied practice. The crucible of nigredo has done something important. It forced raw contents into visibility. But visibility is only the precondition. Transformation demands iteration, small tests, and a community that can bear witness. We will take up those next steps, the techniques, the disciplinary scaffolding, and the risks that accompany deeper dives. By translating alchemical images into concrete experiments you can run over weeks and months. For now, hold the image of the workshop, the blackened wood of the bench, the soot of the furnace, and the first cautious sweep of a rag that finds a small patch of grain beneath the grime. That small patch is the beginning of a surface you can work with. It is the first evidence that the inside can change what appears outside. From the faint gleam on the cleaned patch of bench, the process moves forward. Albedo is not simply a nicer mood, it is a shift in stance. Where nigredo demanded dissent and exposure, albedo offers a reflective posture. You begin to stand slightly apart from your own stories and look at them as phenomena rather than as absolute facts. The inner voice that used to run the show now becomes an informant you can question. This is the whitening not of denial but of clarity, a clearing of the lens through which you perceive the world. Psychologically, albedo shows up as a kind of observational capacity. You notice the tempo of your thought, the recurrent metaphors you use, and the habitual narratives that return like seasons. Emotionally, you may feel relief alongside vulnerability. Relief because some of the strangling certainty has loosened. Vulnerability because without that certainty you must learn a different way to act. Externally, albedo produces small repairs. Conversations that would have escalated now have the possibility of being rerouted. Work choices may be reconsidered with newly visible motives. Relationships begin to be negotiated with clearer boundaries. But the characteristic danger at this stage is inertia disguised as insight. Many people collect insights and then use the collection as a substitute for living differently. The mind can become a museum of observations where nothing leaves the glass case. The Hermetic lens insists that thought must move into behavior, otherwise the mirror only tells you what you already see. The central test of albedo is whether insight leads to altered action and thus different outcomes. To make albedo operational, here are practices adapted to this stage. First, precision journaling. Move beyond lists of feelings to a catalogue of trigger-response chains. For each occasion you feel activated, write the trigger, what happened, the immediate thought, what you told yourself, the felt sensation, where in the body, the impulse, what you were inclined to do, and the actual action taken. Over a week, this data becomes a map. You do not need to write essays. Short entries, even fragments, are enough. The point is to gather evidence rather than dwell in interpretation. Second, reflective mapping with trusted feedback. Choose one relationship or project where patterns repeat. Describe for yourself the usual script in 3 sentences, then invite one trusted interlocutor, a friend, mentor or therapist, to read the description and offer their perspective on what might be blind spots. Ask specifically, what habitual responses do you see me make? What do you imagine I might not be acknowledging? External feedback operates like a mirror that shows angles your self-observation misses. Third, dream amplification and image dialogues. Where Nigredo asked you to note images, albedo asks you to converse with them. Write down a dream image and then write a short imagined reply from that image. If you dream of a closed door, what does the door say? If you dream of a river, what does the river complain about? These small dialogues turn imagery into interlocutors rather than threats, helping you to translate symbolic material into narratives you can work with in waking life. Fourth, an integration experiment. Action with accountability. Pick one insight from your journal that suggests a small behavior change. Design an experiment of limited scope and time, 3 weeks, 1 social habit, 1 workplace adjustment, and attach 1 external accountability, a weekly check-in with a colleague or a simple note to a friend at the end of each week, summarizing what you tried and what happened. The accountability keeps insight from evaporating into private intention. Let me ground this with a story, and then with a quick historical image that explains why this stage matters. Let me show you what this looks like. Marcus taught high school English. For years, his inner narrative had been a quiet contempt he barely admitted. If I tried to be more vulnerable, I'd be judged as weak. This script shaped every faculty meeting and parent conference. He noticed, during a Nigredo period precipitated by illness in his family, that his usual complaints about colleagues had hardened into actual arguments and isolation. Entering albedo, he began the precision journaling practice, noting triggers, emails, perceived slights, thoughts, they're undermining me, impulses, sarcasm, and actions, cutting people off. With a colleague's permission, he asked for feedback. They told him he closed off after 1 disagreement and rarely offered repair. Marcus designed an experiment. In 3 meetings, he would speak first about one thing he appreciated in another's work. It felt awkward and risky. The first time he did it, a colleague visibly softened and later offered help with his course planning. That small external change gave Marcus evidence, not proof of a utopian transformation, but proof that different inner scripts could yield different outward dynamics. And here's the image the alchemist used for this stage, because it's surprisingly precise. In several alchemical manuscripts, the stage of whitening is described as the washing of the metal until impurities float. The image matters because washing is an active process. Water moves, the hand scrubs, the sediment is watched for signs. This is precisely the albedo task for the psyche. You are not simply waiting for a cleaner mood. You are actively testing, rinsing, and discerning what is useful to keep and what must be poured away. The alchemists were speaking from repeated practice. Whitening follows intentional labor, not passive waiting. Observe the balance you must keep, neither rushing to action without sufficient clarity nor remaining in a perpetual workshop of notes. The alchemical wisdom encourages a posture of enough seeing to do enough doing. When the outer world begins to respond, fewer fights, slightly different opportunities, more candid conversations, you are entering the terrain of citrinitas, the dawning of purpose. Citrinitas historically connotes the yellowing or the first appearance of light in the metal as the great work proceeds. Psychologically, it marks the emergence of an integrated meaning or value that begins to organize choices toward a new direction. Where albedo gave you observation and small corrections, citrinitas offers orientation. You start to sense what matters enough to commit energy toward. This is the stage where purpose consolidates and where vocational questions become less abstract and more practical. Internally, citrinitas often presents as a quieter confidence. The frantic need to prove oneself declines. Curiosity and experimentation increase. You may feel drawn to certain projects or roles, not because they will elevate status, but because they resonate. Externally, citrinitas manifests as vocational reorientation, shifts in friendship patterns toward people who support your emerging priorities, and more coherent daily rhythms that align with your newly clarified sense of meaning. Practices for citrinitas emphasize iteration and outward testing. First, the prototype week. Choose a small, reversible project that embodies your emerging purpose. If you suspect your vocation involves teaching, offer a short workshop. If you sense a call toward craft, create a 5-item product run and ask for feedback. The key is low-cost trials with short feedback cycles. Document what felt aligned and what drained you. Over several prototype weeks, patterns of fit and misfit become clearer. Second, service experiments. Citrinitas is not merely self-centered meaning. It tends to solidify when offered outwardly. Commit to a consistent act of service for 6 weeks, volunteering an hour each week, mentoring a younger person, or contributing pro bono your skills. Serving turns private meaning into a publicly accountable expression and reveals whether your emerging aims resonate beyond your own meaning-making. Third, values to routine translation. Take 3 values you name as central and translate each into a weekly practice. If presence is a value, commit to a weekly device-free evening with loved ones. If craft is a value, commit to 2 focused hours each Saturday. These routines are the scaffolding that allow meaning to accumulate into habit. Fourth, narrative reauthoring. Write a short paragraph entitled, "What I Am For." Do not frame it as what you are against. Keep it under 120 words. Read it daily for a month and annotate where practice and aspiration diverge. The friction points are the richest data for adjustment. Let me give you 2 quick snapshots of how this looks when it turns into direction. Here's one. Naomi had been a corporate lawyer who woke each morning with a sense of suffocation. During albedo, she discovered the recurrent metaphor, "I am a performer wearing other people's scripts." After 3 prototype weeks, teaching a community legal clinic and mentoring high school mock trial students, she found herself energized in ways her legal practice never elicited. The prototype was not an instant career shift. It was a test that revealed a better fit. Naomi negotiated a reduced billable hours target and spent 1 morning per week at the clinic. Over months, her outer life shifted. Fewer late-night billable hours, a different network of colleagues, and a new rhythm that reflected an inner reorientation toward mentorship and teaching. Here's another. Tariq had an idea, a social enterprise that combined food skills with job training. Tariq had the inklings of an idea, a social enterprise that combined food skills with job training. Fear had kept him in safety. Citrinitas invited him to a prototype week, partner with a local shelter to run a 4-hour cooking class. The class drew a small, mixed crowd and yielded feedback that clarified what his enterprise might actually need. The result was not instant success, but an actionable pivot. He learned that the business model needed to integrate employer partnerships to place trainees. That outward information, gathered through small service experiments, allowed him to adjust offerings and slowly build toward a more sustained project. Citrinitas is a time for courage and for patience. The work requires public testing, which carries risk of failure and exposure. But the Hermetic framing reminds us internal reorientation precedes stable outward formation. The new thought forms, the sense of what I am for, act as magnets for new opportunities and relationships. They change the questions you ask and the invitations you accept. If you are patient, the small outward experiments aggregate into a visible turning of life toward alignment. Finally comes rubedo, the reddening, the integration that allows life to express inner transformation consistently. Rubedo is not perfection. It is the stage where your activity regularly mirrors your inner orientation. The self, in Jungian terms, finds a more regular residence in the center of your life, and the ego functions as a reliable servant rather than an anxious tyrant. Actions flow from integrated priorities, compassion and strength coexist, and your outer life bears the imprint of an inner reorganization. In rubedo, internally you experience a steadier sense of identity that is less reactive and more generative. Externally, you may find long-term projects sustained, relationships deepened with mature boundaries, and a vocation that is durable and meaningful. The hallmark of rubedo is consistency, not uniform success, but a consistent pattern where the life you lead is recognizably produced by your inner alignment. Practices for rubedo focus on sustainability and contribution. First, commitment to a long-term creative or service project. Choose something that requires regular, ongoing investment over at least 6 months. A community initiative, a book, an apprenticeship, or a sustained artistic practice. The objective is not quick reward, but patient cultivation. Second, mature boundary practices. Rubedo demands that you protect the forms that allow your integrated life to continue. This might look like saying no to offers that fragment your time, delegating tasks that are better handled by others, and enforcing rhythms that make deep work possible. Third, mentoring and reciprocity. One mark of the stage is that you become available as a guide to those earlier on the path. Commit to mentoring one person in a structured way. The act of teaching consolidates wisdom and makes you accountable to standards larger than personal comfort. Fourth, ritualized reflection. Establish a quarterly review of your projects and relationships with an eye toward coherence. What is alive? What is draining? What needs reorientation? Use this review not as a performance audit, but as an orientation check. Is your outer life still reverberating with your inner aims? Let me show you 2 versions of what this looks like when it becomes a life rhythm. Here's one version. Javier, after years of iterative work, finally undertook a long-term project, a community arts collective that combined teaching with public exhibitions. He maintained boundaries, specific hours and specific roles, and designed decision-making processes that allowed the collective to flourish without his endless micromanagement. The collective's public work matched his inner aim to create spaces where marginalized voices could find craft and audience. Over several years, the project neither made him immune to setbacks nor promised financial ease. It did, however, produce a life where the work he did each day clearly reflected what his inner life valued. And here's another. Rena was known for a decades-long career in hospital nursing. After years of Citrinitas experiments, short-term trainings, volunteer leadership, and a shift to community health, she created a program that trained caregivers in compassionate practices. Her daily routine reflected the integration she had achieved. Clear morning rituals, scheduled deep work time, and a practice of monthly community supervision. She experienced rubido not as a final plateau, but as a rhythm of life that allowed her to contribute sustainably without being consumed. Even as rubido offers a form of integration, the Hermetic path reminds us that work continues. The self is not a static trophy, but an organizing center that requires maintenance. Life will always present new tests, losses, and transitions that call for renewed descent and subsequent ascents. The Hermetic claim that outer life echoes inner structure is not a single completed sentence. It is an ongoing grammar that you learn to read and edit. Across these stages, risks recur and deserve sober attention. Mortificatio, the liturgical term the alchemists used for the dying necessary in transformation, can be misread as gratuitous suffering. In practice, parts of ourselves must loosen, and that is painful. Compulsory immersion without support can become destructive. The descent into shadow sometimes approaches clinical intensity. Persistent dissociation, hallucinations, or sustained suicidal ideation. When such signs appear, they are not metaphors to be heroically endured. They demand immediate professional attention. The Hermetic path is not an experimental arena for untreated severe mental health crises. Strong emotion, vivid dreams, and existential questioning are part of the work. But when basic functioning deteriorates, sleep collapses, appetite disappears, reality testing wanes, reach out to trained clinicians or crisis resources. Practical safeguards reduce the likelihood that inner work devolves into self-sabotage. Keep a containment plan. Maintain basic rhythms of sleep and nutrition. Identify 2 people you can call when overwhelm arises. Schedule regular contact with a therapist or supervisor if your dive into shadow intensifies. Reduce emotionally charged experiments during times of external instability, major losses, moves, or legal troubles. And cultivate community, intimate, reliable companions who will tell you plainly when you have drifted into romanticizing suffering. Another danger is the seduction of grand narrative. Transformation can tip into self-congratulation. I am awake and therefore superior. Such postures create new forms of separation and projection. The humble Hermetic approach remains experimental and accountable. Value curiosity over certainty. Prefer demonstrable shifts in behavior and relationship over rhetorical claims of enlightenment. So let me make this concrete for you, not as a rigid program, but as a rhythm you can actually live with. Think of the next few months as an experiment, not a performance. You're not trying to do this right. You're just giving your inner life enough structure so it doesn't collapse into chaos or drift into avoidance. In the beginning, the first few weeks, your only real job is stabilization. Nothing dramatic. You're not fixing your life yet. You're just creating enough containment so the system can calm down. That means waking up at roughly the same time, protecting your sleep, and giving yourself a short daily window, 10, maybe 15 minutes, to check in with what's actually happening inside you, not philosophically, practically. What triggered you today? What thought followed? What did you feel in your body, and what did you do next? Once a week, try one small interruption, one moment where you don't follow the old automatic response. And once a week, have one honest conversation with someone you trust, not to vent endlessly, but to name where you need boundaries while things are intense. Safety matters here. Know who you would reach out to if things tipped from difficult into overwhelming. After a few weeks, something usually shifts. You're no longer just inside the storm. You can start observing it. That's when the work becomes reflective rather than purely stabilizing. At this stage, your attention turns toward patterns. You notice what repeats. You might jot down a dream image in the morning, or simply note the same thought showing up again and again. And once a week, it helps to check your view against reality, to ask someone you trust how they experience you, not to judge yourself, but to see what you can't see alone. Then you test one small change, just one. You act slightly differently in a situation that normally runs on autopilot, and you watch what actually happens. Later, your attention naturally shifts outward. You start asking a different question, not "what's wrong with me?" but "what am I for?" This is where you experiment with direction. You spend small amounts of time creating, teaching, offering something useful, or serving in a way that feels oddly energizing rather than draining. Nothing permanent, just prototypes. Try things. Gather data. Pay attention to where energy increases instead of collapses. Once a week, you test this orientation in the real world. A short workshop, a contribution, a conversation that expresses what you're becoming rather than what you're afraid of. Eventually, the work becomes about continuity, less searching, more sustaining. Your days begin with a simple ritual that reminds you what matters. Your evenings include a quick boundary check. What preserved your focus today and what eroded it? Each week, you protect at least a small block of uninterrupted time for something that deserves long-term care. And over time, you may find yourself guiding someone else, not as an expert, but as a steward of a path you've actually walked. Every few months, you pause and review, not to judge, but to recalibrate what's alive, what's draining, what needs trimming so the essential things can keep growing. Throughout all of this, the questions stay simple. When you felt most reactive this week, what was the exact thought running the show? Which small action shifted something, even slightly? What image kept returning in your mind? And whose feedback did you notice and actually take seriously? That's the rhythm, not a checklist, not a test, just a way of letting inner change move, step by step, into lived reality. Measures of progress are practical, fewer escalations in relationships, more precise choices about time and energy, prototypes completed and iterated, sustained small acts of service, and clearer routines preserved despite external stress. Progress in inner life looks like increased range of response. Progress in outer life looks like different results from the same starting conditions. If you find yourself stuck at any point, endlessly talking about change without changing behavior, or cycling between breakdown and temporary stabilization, revise the scaffold. Bring in external accountability. Scale down the intensity of inner work, or seek a different mentor. It is not a failure to slow down, it is prudence. Hermetic work, as the tradition implies, is a craft that respects materials and timing. Practices to cultivate attention, the hinge of inner to outer translation, deserve daily care. Begin mornings with a simple attention-setting ritual. 3 minutes of noticing breath, 1 sentence of intention, not a plan, but a tone. Today I will practice asking curiously, and a single practical micro-goal. End the day with a short data entry. 1 success, 1 frustration, and 1 micro-experiment for tomorrow. Over time, these tiny moves compound. Projection deserves additional, explicit practice. The simplest anti-projection drill is phrase replacement. When you notice a negative attribution of another's motive, "They did that to hurt me," practice substituting neutral or multiple possibilities. "They may have been distracted," or "they have reasons unrelated to me." This does not mean lying to yourself. It means training your mind to consider alternative explanations before acting. With repetition, the behavioral spirals initiated by automatic projections reduce. Throughout all this, hold the Hermetic claim as interpretive rather than mystical. As within, so without, is a way of reading causality in human life that privileges attention and habit as formative forces. It does not claim that thoughts alone magically reconfigure external systems beyond your agency. It claims that habitual attention channels perception and choices in ways that, over time, shape relational and practical outcomes. The alchemical stages are a map, not a guarantee. Let me give you a few very small things you can actually start tonight, not as a program, just as simple moves that keep the work grounded. In the evening, take 5 minutes. Just 5. Pick one moment from the day that stayed with you. What triggered it? What was the exact thought that followed? Where did you feel it in your body? What were you pulled to do? And what did you actually do? Then ask one last question. If tomorrow presented the same moment again, what's one slightly different action you could try? In the morning, before the day takes over, give yourself 2 minutes. Name one intention in the form of an action, not a mood. Today I will slow down before responding. Or, today I will ask one honest question. Take 5 slow breaths and picture one small step that makes that intention real. If anxiety tends to make you withdraw, try a very simple experiment for a few weeks. Choose one person. Once a week, send a short, honest check-in message, nothing dramatic. Then just notice what happens, how they respond, and how it feels in you before and after you send it. And if images or dreams have been showing up, give them a minute instead of pushing them away. Write the image down when you wake up. Then write 2 lines, as if the image itself was speaking to you about your life right now. You don't need to interpret it. Just let it speak. Keep all of this modest, repeatable. This work isn't a pilgrimage toward a single revelation. It's more like a workshop. The same bench, the same tools, small projects done again and again until something real starts to take shape. Now, to close with the image we began with, imagine a mirror in your hands and a small crucible beside it. The mirror shows you, sometimes beautiful, sometimes disfigured by soot, the current arrangement of your mind. The crucible is the place where you heat, melt, and recombine elements of yourself into new forms. The Hermetic claim is a simple instruction. What you hold before the mirror, the habits of attention, the recurrent narratives, the images that populate your idle mind, will, if unexamined, find a way into the structure of your days. But the good news is reciprocal. Whatever you bring into the crucible, attentively tended and honestly tested, will in time produce different furniture for your life. Why your life reflects your thoughts. Hermetic Law 1 is not a promise of magic but an invitation to craft. The inner world sets the patterns. With attentive work, disciplined experiments, and the humility to ask for help when needed, those patterns can be altered. In the long run, the gold the alchemists sought was not a metal ironclad against sorrow. It was the capacity to live with integrity, to let the life you lead be a faithful expression of the life you have labored to know. If you stayed with this all the way to the end, that says something about the kind of inner work you're willing to do. So write in the comments, I stayed until the end. Right now, I'm leaving another video on your screen that builds directly on what we explored today. Thank you for being here, my friend, and I'll see you in the next video.